When HOA officials ripped a life-saving medical backpack off 12-year-old Liam, his heart stopped right there on the playground. Dana Holloway, the HOA president, knew about his condition, but called him a liability and wanted to teach him a lesson. What they didn't know was that Liam's father was a litigation attorney, and he was about to turn their cruelty into a national case. But just wait until you see how this courtroom battle exploded, and why justice, in the end, struck back harder than anyone expected. It started with a knock, not the kind you get from a neighbor stopping by with a smile and a pie. No, this one was sharp, repetitive, irritated, 3 short bursts that said, "We're not here to chat." Trevor Reed wiped his hands on a dish towel, took a deep breath, and opened the front door of his suburban 2-story in Sunset Hills, only to find 2 people standing on his porch with the stiff posture of bureaucrats on a mission. They weren't cops, but they had the same posture, same smug, overpracticed expressions, matching navy polo shirts, HOA name badges gleaming in the sun like sheriff stars. The woman in front looked about 50, blonde bob tucked perfectly into her collar, not a hair out of place. Her lips were tight, her eyes sharper than the knock. Dana Holloway, head of the Sunset Hills Homeowners Association. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her. She was the type who quoted bylaws like scripture and treated flower bed violations like felony charges. The man beside her, Mitch something, stood with a clipboard and a fake casual look, like he'd rather be anywhere else but would still enjoy watching someone get fined. "Oh, Mr. Reed," Dana began, voice honeyed but brittle. "We've had several complaints about your son." Trevor frowned, confused. "My son?" "Yes," she said with a forced sigh, "running unsupervised in common areas, carrying suspicious equipment, and repeatedly violating the community's bag size restrictions." For a moment, Trevor didn't respond. Not because he was angry, not yet. He was still trying to understand what the hell she was talking about. Liam? His son Liam? The 12-year-old who could barely walk a block without resting? The kid who had been through 3 open-heart surgeries by the time he was 9? He blinked. "Wait, are you talking about his backpack?" Dana didn't flinch. "It's considerably larger than allowed in Section 12B of the HOA covenant," she said crisply. "It obstructs sight lines, presents a tripping hazard, and causes unease among other residents, especially the children." "Because of a backpack," Trevor echoed. "Because of an unauthorized device," Dana corrected, her voice colder now, "which emits sounds, lights, and displays wires. We've received 3 written complaints and several verbal ones." Trevor took a slow breath. "That's not a device. That's a medical pack. My son has an artificial heart. That pack keeps him alive." Dana gave a strained smile, the kind that didn't touch her eyes. "We understand your position as a parent. However, community guidelines apply equally to everyone. Your son is free to use standard-sized accessories in the common areas like any other resident." "Standard-sized?" Trevor stopped himself, running a hand down his face. "Do you even know what that pack does?" Dana tilted her head. "I believe you mentioned something about a heart?" Trevor could feel his pulse rising. "It's custom engineered. It regulates blood flow, power supply, emergency backup. It's not a backpack. It's life support." Mitch finally spoke up, eyes still on his clipboard. "There's no medical exemption form on file for your household." "I submitted it 6 months ago," Trevor snapped, "twice." "Well," Dana said brightly, ignoring that completely, "consider this your formal notice." She pulled a folded piece of paper from a slim folder and handed it to Trevor. The paper was crisp, freshly printed, HOA letterhead at the top, like some kind of seal of judgment. Violation notice. Non-compliant accessory item on HOA property. Offense, repeated use of oversized or non-standard equipment in shared public zones. Immediate corrective action required. Trevor stared at it, reading the words twice, then a third time, each one digging deeper. "You're citing my son. For existing." Dana's smile didn't fade. "We're citing him for violating clearly established regulations." Trevor's voice dropped. "He's 12. He can't survive without that pack." "Then perhaps you should consider private accommodations," she said, the polite menace in her voice unmistakable. "The HOA has a responsibility to the comfort and safety of all residents." Trevor looked at her and saw something horrifyingly familiar. the calm, unshakable conviction of someone who thought they were doing the right thing, because the rules told them so. No nuance, no mercy, just policy. Dana and Mitch turned and walked back down the front path as if they'd just handed out a parking ticket. Trevor closed the door quietly behind them, still holding the notice, knuckles white. The paper crumpled slightly in his grip, and he didn't even notice. Upstairs, he could hear Liam's monitor beeping steadily from his bedroom. Trevor looked down at the letter again, then at the front door, and just like that, something inside him shifted. This wasn't going to be another petty HOA dispute. This was war. Liam didn't understand what the fuss was about. He never did. That night, while they sat around the kitchen table eating leftover lasagna and garlic bread, the issue barely grazed his radar. Trevor had brought it up gently, mentioned that the HOA had dropped by, but Liam, all elbows and innocence, just blinked between bites. "Am I in trouble?" he asked, tilting his head, his shaggy brown hair falling across one eye. "No, kiddo," Trevor said, forcing a smile. They think your backpack's a problem." Liam frowned. "Because of the heart?" "Yeah." For a moment, there was silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that sneaks in when a kid realizes something big is happening, but isn't sure what to do with it. His mom, Jenna, reached across the table and squeezed his hand. He squeezed back like he always did. "So, can I still go to the park tomorrow?" he asked. Trevor hesitated. The park was technically public. Open access, city-funded. But here in Sunset Hills, the HOA managed the landscaping, the benches, even the trash cans. And HOA control, Trevor had learned, meant their rules, their enforcement, their reality. He exhaled slowly. "Just keep your bag close, okay?" Liam nodded, as if that made everything better. As if keeping the bag closer would somehow protect him from the people determined to pretend it didn't need to exist at all. What Trevor didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly imagined, was that within 48 hours it would no longer be about warnings or words. It would become something irreversible. It happened on a Saturday afternoon. Bright skies, mild breeze, families out enjoying the weekend. Liam had gone to the park with his basketball, the one with faded blue stripes, and parked himself on a bench to rest between shots. He wasn't running, he wasn't bothering anyone, just sitting there, taking deep breaths, listening to his portable monitor beep quietly inside the pack that hummed on his back like a quiet engine. That's when Dana Holloway showed up. Witnesses later said she looked determined, purposeful, not angry, not unhinged, just focused, like someone carrying out a task they believed was their duty. Mitch Rayner followed close behind, clipboard in hand, phone in the other. Dana pointed at Liam. There was no greeting, no explanation. They walked right up to him. Liam looked up, confused, mid-sip from his water bottle. "Your equipment is in violation of community policy," Dana said flatly. And then, without asking, without warning, without checking what the hell he was doing, Mitch reached down and grabbed the strap of Liam's backpack. What happened next lasted maybe 4 seconds. Mitch yanked the strap over Liam's shoulder. The weight shifted. A wire snapped. A tube disconnected. The pack tumbled out of his hands and hit the pavement with a metallic clunk. And Liam dropped. Not like a faint or a slow slump. He collapsed. No scream, no warning. Just a limp, sudden thud, like someone cutting the strings on a marionette. He hit the ground with his cheek first. The heart monitor let out a long, shrill flatline. Someone screamed. Someone else called 911. Jenna was the first to get the call. She picked up and immediately went silent, then dropped the phone. Trevor grabbed it, and all he heard on the other end was, "Your son collapsed at the park. There's an ambulance on the way." He drove like a man possessed. By the time Trevor reached the emergency room, Liam was already inside, unconscious, intubated, barely clinging to life. A nurse tried to calm him, told him that the team had managed to restart the artificial system after 12 minutes, that Liam had technically coded, that they didn't know yet what the long-term damage might be. Trevor didn't hear most of it. He was staring at the bag they'd laid on the counter. It was torn. One of the battery compartments was cracked open. A tube hung loose like a ripped artery. There was blood smeared along the zipper, tiny fingerprints in red, as if Liam had tried to hold it together before he blacked out. And then Trevor looked down and realized he'd been clenching his fists so tightly his own nails had broken skin. He didn't cry. Not yet. He just stood there in the ER hallway, in his sweat-stained shirt and shaking hands, staring through the glass at his son. And he felt something heavy and ancient rise in his chest. This wasn't just negligence. This wasn't just ignorance. They had laid hands on a child's life support system, and in that moment, Trevor Reed made a quiet promise. They're not walking away from this. Doctors worked miracles. That's what they told him. Trevor stood there in the fluorescent haze of the ICU, gripping the rail of Liam's bed while a team of nurses moved with rehearsed urgency around his son's small, motionless body. Tubes ran from every angle. Machines beeped in nervous rhythms. A pale blue light blinked faintly on Liam's chest, where the surgical port had been reconnected, patched, not fixed, restarted, not restored. The cardiologist, a worn-looking man with kind eyes and the posture of someone who lived between surgeries, stepped out into the hallway and spoke in a low voice, like he didn't want the walls to hear. The backpack was ripped with too much force, he said. It detached the central line. The system shut down almost immediately. By the time paramedics arrived, his chest cavity had already begun to fill with fluid. Trevor didn't speak. He lost oxygen to the brain for a full minute before we got the pump back online. The damage may not be reversible. Trevor nodded once, mechanically, as if acknowledging a weather report. Then he sat down on the narrow hospital bench, leaned forward and locked his hands together so tightly his knuckles turned white. His phone vibrated in his pocket, but he didn't check it. There was no text, no email, no call that mattered more than the simple, unbearable fact that his son was still unconscious. Still silent, still vulnerable. 12 years old. 12. Donna Holloway and Mitch Rayner hadn't broken a rule. They hadn't misunderstood a form or overstepped with a citation. They had laid their hands on a child's lifeline, pulled it off like it was luggage, like it was some kind of visual nuisance. And now Liam lay on a hospital bed with his lungs damaged, his heart barely beating under manufactured rhythm, his entire future hanging by wires and a surgeon's prayer. It was almost midnight by the time Trevor returned home. The house was dark, still. Jenna had stayed behind at the hospital. The guest room was lit dimly for him, a throw blanket folded neatly on the couch, like someone believed he might sleep. He didn't. He walked up the driveway slowly, keys in one hand, hospital wristband still clinging to the other. And that's when he saw it. Another notice, bright yellow, taped right to the front door like a slap in the face. He stepped closer. You are now in violation of Section 4B, aggressive residence and unapproved medical claims. He stared at it, not for 5 seconds, not for 10, for a full minute. The wind rustled behind him. A car passed by. A sprinkler clicked on across the street. But Trevor didn't move. He just stood there, holding the paper in his eyes like it was written in another language, one he suddenly understood too well. Aggressive resident, unapproved medical claims, that's what they called it. Not attempted murder, not violent negligence, not an assault on a medically dependent child. No, a policy infraction. Trevor peeled the notice from the door slowly, deliberately, like it might burn his hands. He looked at it for a few more seconds. Then he crushed it in his fist, not in a burst of rage, not in some theatrical display. He crushed it the way you crush something that never mattered to begin with. And then, for the first time that day, he spoke aloud. Not this time. His voice was low, flat, final. See, Trevor Reed wasn't just a father. He was a litigation attorney, not a civil lawyer, not some contract desk jockey. He specialized in liability. He'd gone up against hospitals, insurance giants, pharmaceutical companies. He knew how the system worked, how it hid, how it protected the worst behind red tape and legal fog. But this wasn't some faceless corporation. This was personal, and he wasn't calling a lawyer. He was the lawyer. And by the time he was done, the entire Sunset Hills HOA would wish all they'd ever done was overwater a lawn. Because now, Trevor had something more dangerous than anger. He had evidence, he had motive, and most dangerous of all, he had nothing left to lose. Trevor wasted no time. The morning after Liam stabilized, he filed a criminal complaint, felony assault with intent to harm a minor. He followed it with a civil lawsuit against the Sunset Hills HOA, naming Dana Holloway and Mitch Rayner personally for negligence, willful endangerment, and civil conspiracy. Dana's lawyer dismissed it as a tragic misunderstanding. They claimed they didn't know Liam's backpack was medical, that there was no malice, just confusion. But then the video surfaced. A mother at the park had filmed the incident. Clear as day, you could hear Dana say, "If we let this kid break rules, others will too." And right before Mitch ripped the pack from Liam's shoulder, Dana muttered, "Let's teach this one a lesson." In court, the room went dead silent. The judge immediately demanded all HOA communications. What they uncovered changed everything. Internal emails showed Dana had received Liam's medical exemption months earlier and dismissed it. One message read, "Not our problem. Keep eyes on the kid." Another, "We need to shut this down before it becomes precedent." It was no accident, no misunderstanding. They had seen the warning, and they had acted anyway. The charge was upgraded to attempted murder. Trevor didn't flinch. He had only just begun. The emails weren't redacted. That's what stunned the prosecution team the most. When the judge ordered full discovery, no one expected the HOA to hand over anything remotely incriminating without a fight. But there they were, time-stamped, initialed, archived. Lines of cold, digital ink spelling out exactly what Trevor already knew. They had known. They had all known. 6 months earlier, Dana Holloway had received a formal medical exemption. It was sent by Liam's cardiologist, complete with documentation, diagrams, emergency protocol, and a clearly worded note. This child's medical support system must not be tampered with under any circumstances. This pack functions as his external heart. Dana read it, forwarded it to Mitch Rayner, and typed just 5 words beneath it. "Don't care, he's still a liability." Mitch replied, "So what do you want done?" Another board member chimed in just hours later with the chilling reply, "Then deal with it." There was no confusion, no policy debate, no calls to legal counsels or ethics reviews. Just quiet agreement that a disabled child had become inconvenient and needed to be handled. When those emails were presented in court, the judge didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply turned to the prosecutor, nodded once, and said, "You may add attempted murder to the charges." Trevor sat motionless in the gallery, hands clasped, jaw clenched. He wasn't smiling. This wasn't victory. Not yet. This was only confirmation of what he'd known the moment he saw Liam's pale face in that hospital bed. This wasn't a mistake. It was calculated. And if he didn't take it all the way, it would happen again, to someone else's son, in some other neighborhood, where the rules mattered more than the lives behind them. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want apologies. He wanted precedent. He wanted to make it law that this kind of cruelty, masked as compliance, would cost everything. That HOA boards across the country would flinch before daring to touch what wasn't theirs to touch. That the name Liam Reed would live in legal briefs and regulatory clauses, not because of what was done to him, but because of what came after. The trial date was set for early spring. Word spread faster than expected. What started as a local incident grew into national outrage. News outlets picked it up. Disability rights organizations launched campaigns. A petition hit 1 million signatures in a week. By the time jury selection began, protesters stood outside the courthouse holding signs that read, "A backpack is not a threat," and "Justice for Liam." On the first day of trial, the courtroom was packed. Cameramen lined the back wall. Sketch artists flipped their pads as the doors opened. Trevor wheeled Liam in himself. The boy was thin, pale, and still healing. His chest was wrapped beneath his shirt, tubes feeding into ports along his ribs. A nurse trailed behind silently, eyes alert. Liam didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The sound of his wheels across the floor was enough. He stared forward with that distant, hollow look children get when they've seen something they don't know how to name. No fear, just silence. And for the first time since this had all started, Dana Holloway didn't look smug. She didn't meet Trevor's eyes. She didn't wave to anyone in the gallery. She sat still, shoulders stiff, the weight of the courtroom pressing down like a judgment before the verdict. Mitch sat beside her, hands folded tightly in his lap, eyes darting between jurors. They both looked smaller now, not because they were losing, but because the world had finally seen what they really were, and there was nowhere left to hide. The courtroom was still, not tense, not buzzing, just still. As the lights dimmed slightly for the screen, you could have heard a pen drop. The judge gave a quiet nod. The prosecutor hit play. The video began. A grainy view of a sunny park, children playing, parents talking. Liam, alone on a bench, sipping from a bottle, his backpack resting securely against his back. Then Dana Holloway entered the frame. Beside her, Mitch Rayner, clipboard in one hand, a phone in the other. They didn't speak to Liam. They didn't ask a question. They just approached. The jury leaned in. You could hear Dana's voice. If we let this kid break rules, others will too. Then, a moment later, quieter, almost beneath her breath, let's teach this one a lesson. And then the sound. Not loud, but unmistakable. Fabric tearing. A strap snapping, a hollow metallic clatter. Then silence. Then Liam's body hitting the ground. There was no scream on the tape, no shouting, just the high-pitched whine of the heart monitor going flat. Someone in the courtroom gasped. Another covered their mouth, but no one spoke. The video ended. The screen went dark. And Trevor stood. He walked to the center of the room. No notes, no slideshow, no props. Just him and the truth. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He began with facts. His son's birth defect. The first surgery at 6 weeks old, the second at 2 years, the third, most invasive, at 10, where they implanted a mechanical pump to assist Liam's failing heart. He explained the equipment, the bag, the battery, the tubing, the oxygen regulators, the things most people never saw because his son never complained. He described the day Liam was finally able to play again, how the bag gave him freedom, a chance to just be a boy, not a diagnosis. And then he paused, not for effect, but because the weight of it hit him. Again. He looked at the jury, and in a voice quieter than the hum of the courtroom lights, he said, all of it, every surgery, every sleepless night, every risk, every prayer, all of it, was almost erased because my son's medical device didn't match their aesthetic. He gestured toward the defense table where Dana sat frozen, eyes wet. They didn't ask. They didn't question. They just saw something they didn't like, and they tore it off him like it was trash. Dana broke. On the stand, she wept, spoke of regret, of misunderstanding, of never meaning harm. But the jury didn't cry. They didn't nod. They sat still and listened. 3 hours later, the verdict came down. Guilty, on all counts. Attempted murder, reckless endangerment of a minor, civil conspiracy. Dana stared ahead, as if the words didn't register. Mitch slumped back in his seat. Trevor didn't smile. He simply looked at Liam. His son, his fighter, still resting in that wheelchair, wrapped in bandages and plastic tubes, and nodded once. Not because they'd won, but because, for the first time since this nightmare began, someone else had finally said the truth out loud. And this time, the system listened. The Sunset Hills HOA was no more. Following the verdict, the board was dissolved. Every officer removed. The neighborhood reorganized under new leadership. Residents who valued people over policy, safety over appearance. The community bylaws were suspended and rewritten under the guidance of a state mediator. And for the first time in years, Sunset Hills started to feel like a place where families could breathe. But courtroom justice was only the first ripple. Dana Holloway was sentenced to 12 years for attempted murder. Mitch Rayner received 15 due to his physical role and damning digital communications. Both were denied parole. The judge called their actions a deliberate and dangerous abuse of civilian authority. But the real impact came weeks later when federal lawmakers passed what would become known as Liam's Law, a nationwide regulation banning any HOA, property board, or community association from restricting certified medical equipment or attire in public or shared spaces. Civil penalties were steep. Criminal charges were on the table. Training was mandated nationwide. Trevor never asked for that. But the country was ready. Letters came from across the U.S. Parents, grandparents, teachers, nurses. One from Florida read, "My son has a chest pump. We've been asked to leave pools, parks, even libraries. When I watched your case, I cried. You gave us hope." Another from Illinois. You didn't just fight for your son, you fought for ours, too. Trevor read them quietly each night, sometimes aloud to Jenna. They didn't post them online. They didn't need to. They kept them in a shoebox, stacked with care, proof that one voice could ripple far beyond the courtroom. And then, 2 months after the trial, Liam came home, still healing, still quiet, but alive. On his second morning back, while crunching cereal, he looked up from his bowl and asked, "Can I go to the park today?" Trevor paused. The same park where his heart had stopped. The same bench, the same space. But now, the rules were different. Now, it was his. Trevor smiled, leaned across the table and said, "You can go wherever the hell you want." Liam grinned, and just like that, the world tilted back into place. Because sometimes justice isn't loud. It isn't even about punishment. Sometimes it's a whisper. A boy in a wheelchair, a father who refused to back down, a backpack that carried not just a heart, but a movement, 1 year to the day. That's how long it had been since Liam's heart stopped beating on a public bench under a clear sky, because someone thought rules mattered more than a child's life. And now, under a sky just as clear, the town of Sunset Hills stood still once more. But this time, not in horror. This time, they stood in honor. The mayor adjusted the microphone, tapped it once, and looked out at the crowd that had gathered, rows of folding chairs filled with families, kids in strollers, local press, and a surprising number of HOA leaders from across the county, invited but unspoken. No one dared speak over the quiet. They all knew what today was. "Thank you all for being here," the mayor began. "Today we recognize not a tragedy, but a triumph." Behind him, a freshly painted sign gleamed in the afternoon light. Liam Reed, Memorial Field. A pause followed, then soft applause. Trevor stood beside Liam near the front, holding his son's hand. Liam wore a navy blue button-up, sleeves rolled up to the elbows. His hair had grown back, his color had returned, and though the breathing monitor still clicked softly beneath his shirt, he stood a little taller than he had that year before. When the mayor stepped aside and motioned to him, Liam took one breath, just one, and walked forward. He reached the ribbon that stretched across the new field entrance. Silver scissors were placed gently in his hand. His grip trembled, not from fear, but from the simple effort of holding something still. The crowd leaned in. Parents held their children close. Reporters lowered their cameras. And with one clean cut, the ribbon fell. There was no roar of applause, no explosion of celebration, just the sound of collective breath, relief, awe, recognition. Trevor felt his throat tighten as Liam turned back and smiled, small and proud. His son had cut a ribbon over the same ground where he'd nearly died, and now it would carry his name, not because he was lost, but because he had lived, because he had survived something no child should ever have to face. Trevor looked out at the crowd, at the same faces who once stayed silent, who once looked away. Some had cried in court, some had written letters, and some had said nothing at all. And yet, here they were, watching, remembering. Among them stood a girl with a glucose monitor strapped to her arm, her mother standing tall beside her. A boy with a speech device blinked and waved shyly. A man in a wheelchair rolled forward, tears in his eyes. This was no longer about HOA rules. It was about what came after, because Trevor knew something now, something permanent. Injustice doesn't end in a courtroom. It doesn't end with a sentence, a verdict, or a fine. It ends when people remember, when the next person hesitates before enforcing cruelty, when silence turns into a voice, when communities decide that policy can never again be allowed to override humanity. That's why the sign mattered. That's why the field bore Liam's name, not out of pity, but as a reminder, a promise, a line that says, "Never again." And as the sun dipped low and Liam sat on a nearby bench, this time by choice, not by collapse, Trevor joined him, watching children play across the open grass. No rule signs, no uniform monitors, just kids, being kids. Trevor felt something in his chest he hadn't felt in over a year. Not victory, not justice, hope. Because it didn't start with lawyers or lawmakers. It didn't begin with protests or policy. It started with a boy, a bag, and a heart that refused to stop beating.